You can count when you're happy. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can count when you're sad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or count when you're frightened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Count when you're mad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting is wonderful. Counting is marvelous. Counting's terrific. And how?
The episode opens with the perfect family moment, the Kents laughing and bantering while Clark heats up toast with his heat vision. It's so perfect, it's almost sickening. Practically Leave It to Beaver with superpowers. And by the end, I realize why that's there, and it's for a really great reason. The Kents seem like the perfect family much of the time, and when things are dysfunctional, about 90% of the time it's because of interference from the Luthors. By the end, we come to find that Lionel Luthor played a huge part in Clark's adoption, and that without him, they might not even be a family. The contrast is staggering between the first scene and the flashback toward the end, of Lionel blackmailing Jonathan into convincing the Ross brothers to sell their factory and allow Lionel to move in on Smallville. We see that the price he paid to have what he has was high, and suddenly this family feels a lot more real. I love Lex's line, "Not every marriage is as Rockwellian as Jonathan and Martha Kent's," and we find that theirs really isn't either. There's a woman in town claiming to be Clark's mother, Rachel Dunley, who had an illegitimate son with Lionel, and yep, we're counting those. Her son was handled by Luthor's own Metropolis United Charities, and because it's on record that her son Lucas's adoption was the only one it handled and Clark was the only kid placed by the charity, they must be one and the same, which would make Clark and Lex brothers. She gets nowhere trying to talk to the Kents and Jonathan, naturally tells Clark to stay away from her, so she goes to Lex, hoping he'll change the Kents' mind and let her get to know Clark. When she goes to Lionel, we learn that he gave her a huge sum of money to keep her quiet so she wouldn't expose his transgression to his wife, and also that she was in an institution for a long time. We're left to wonder if she's really mentally ill, or if painting her in that light was part of Lionel's way of dampening her credibility in case she decided to tattle on him, though she certainly looks and acts pretty crazy. Turns out she really is out of her gourd when, after trying everything else, she resorts to drugging and kidnapping Lex and threatens to kill him if Lionel doesn't publicly admit that Clark was their illegitimate son. Lionel, of course, holds a press conference just to say he won't negotiate with kidnappers or terrorists, so this being Smallville, she tries to kill Lex in the most over-the-top way imaginable, swinging an axe over her head, which is stopped by Clark just in the nick of time. Oh well, I guess it still beats the telekinetically flailing chainsaw. Apparently seeing an axe break into pieces across Clark's back is all she needs to decide she and Clark can't possibly be related. Good thing she had such a limited imagination, I guess, and she's carted off to the loony bin. Now, as all this is going on, we learn a lot about everybody's lineages, thus the title. When Clark gets angry with Chloe for looking into Clark's adoption and alerting Dunleavy to his existence, we learn that Chloe's mother ran out on her when she was 5, and Chloe doesn't know why, but is under the impression that her mother wanted and still wants nothing to do with her. We meet the man set up last episode as potentially being Lana's birth father, Henry Small. Get it? The Smallville Smalls, because it can't be an actual small town, it just has to be named after somebody named Small, who she ambushes at home, and he tries to have nothing to do with her, but comes around in the end and agrees to find out if he's her father. We don't know yet by the end. The episode ends with Lionel lying to Lex about the real Lucas Luthor, claiming he placed him with a family, but not the Kents, and that he died before his first birthday. We see that Lionel is holding a locket with a picture of a young boy much older than one, and we're given the impression that he's still alive. Then, credits. This is hands down the best episode of the show this season so far for me, and is a good contender for best episode of the series so far. The ending leaves a bit to be desired because it's the only place in the episode with those predictable formulaic elements that are otherwise avoided, like convenient unconsciousness and a homicidal psychopath stopped by Clark just in the nick of time. Overall, though, this episode feels like a different show. It's deliberately paced and feels like it's really taking its time to get at the core of what everybody's feeling as the tapestry unravels and all these hidden truths are revealed. By the way, I think Mark Snow's excellent score has a lot to do with that. I feel that we really get in everybody's heads with Jonathan's guilt for what he did to the Rosses, and the whole town, really, while trapped in an impossible situation. Clark wanting the answers to his origins so badly, and then being forced to face the reality of them once he has them. Lionel's diabolical madness as he tries to justify cheating on his wife while passionately touching the face of his long ex-lover. And geez, even Lana's stomachable, and not because she's barely in this one. There's a nice parallel between the bombshell Rachel Dunley drops on Clark and the one she drops on Henry Small. I like the moment where Clark's talking about this woman who just shows up out of the blue and says, "Hi Clark, I'm your mom." And he says, "Who does that?" And Lana, embarrassed to admit it, raises her hand because she just did something similar. This show is often so concerned with looking dramatic that these moments of real honesty are often missing. I'm gonna say it, Lana actually feels like a real person here for once. And that's saying something, given that last episode I said I could care less about this subplot. If she were more like this more of the time, I might. She's proactive, and when she meets Henry and he insults her shop because it's owned by the Luthors, and by the way, I love that Lionel's tendrils are spread into nearly every crevice of this story, she doesn't back down, even though it's hard. She only leaves when he tells her to, and sure, she's crying on her way out, but given he was smashing a phone when she came in, talking to some corporate shark he claims was dumping something toxic somewhere, given that he snapped at her as soon as she came in, and given how hard it would be to show someone a photo of himself with your mother and say you might be my father and did you love her, I can't say that I blame her. Now, is there a fair amount of soap opera going on here? Oh, sure. And yeah, it's a little convenient, I suppose, that as usual, all this information about all these families is coming out in the same episode because the theme is Lineage. But it's not as simple as just paralleling stories. Why we find out what we do and when is all pretty reasonable. You couldn't have thrown in a whole subplot about Chloe's mother in the middle of all this, but having Clark in a fit of rage retaliate at her with, "If you want to find someone's mother, find your own," is a great way to get some of her backstory in there. And we don't get much, so it's believable, and we're left to wonder and hope we'll learn more later, which we will. And another episode might not have handled that outburst as well. It might have just had Clark take the moral high ground because Chloe was digging into his adoption after promising she'd stay out of it. Never mind that we're never told why he's digging around on her computer. He's got a point, but I'm not really rooting for him in this scene. He takes it too far, and most importantly, he knows that. Later, he apologizes, saying he was way out of line. I can sympathize with the pressure he's under. Chloe can't possibly understand, because of course, Clark knows his birth parents aren't from Earth, doesn't think he'll ever find them, and he already hates lying and having to pretend that maybe he could find them someday. And he also has to know something had to be finagled in his adoption, because there was no one for him to be adopted from. So not only is Chloe snooping into something more deeply personal than she knows, but also something that could potentially get his parents into a lot of trouble, because even Clark doesn't know exactly how that happened. I was already really enjoying these sorts of real-life questions being asked in the show from the first season. You can get away with a couple raising a kid they found in a spaceship out on a farm in 1938 in a way you can't in 2001, especially if you make Smallville 5 times bigger than you pretend like it is. So the legality of adoption has to come up. And this episode not only pays all that off, but it pays off the entire Kent-Luthor family dynamic in the process. We've had episode after episode comparing and contrasting these families, exploring how these parents raise children, what their children have taken from their parents and their personalities and their worldviews. And while that was my favorite thing about the show, this episode makes all that better because it gives an in-story reason for spending so much time paralleling the two. Now we finally understand why Jonathan hates Lionel so much. Their differences in how they treat people, both personally and professionally, was good enough for why Lionel doesn't trust Lex. I imagine a lot of people in the town feel that way. But Jonathan really comes alive now as we see how personal it is for him. He hates Lionel because Lionel put him in this impossible position, he made a choice, and now he hates himself for it. And there was no easy choice, because any way you slice it, Jonathan would have ended up hating himself. If he had stood his ground, Lionel would have done what he threatened, tell the authorities that Clark's adoption was, in his words, a sham. Clark would have been taken away from them, possibly locked away by the government for scientific research, and sure, Jonathan wouldn't have sacrificed his whole community to a corporate tycoon who treats people like property and dumps toxic waste on their lands, and incidentally also turns employees into Kryptofreaks, but he wouldn't have been happy with himself for what happened to Clark. I think tying Clark and Lex's histories together like this is great stuff, both family-wise and Kryptonian mythos-wise. I think it's cool that Lionel is in such close proximity to the spaceship, riding in the back of that truck without knowing what it is, when years later he'll obsess over learning Clark's origins. And you know, this whole thing could have been a lot sillier. When I first saw this and saw little Clark and little Lex in the truck together, I thought it was irony for the sake of irony. But once you get that scene at the end with Lionel's ultimatum to Jonathan, It isn't that at all. I love that Jonathan saves Lex by rushing him to the hospital, foreshadowing Clark saving him on the bridge years later, and his first impression of Lionel is really telling. This superficial rich man who freezes in a crisis and is so shocked by the sight of his son losing his hair, he can't even reach down and pick him up. I'm glad Lex and Clark only saw each other briefly. It makes sense that neither really remembers it. And although it is silly how little Clark seems to have aged a year or two between scenes, since a reused scene from the pilot transitions into new flashback footage, otherwise, all the new stuff is integrated well, both visually and story-wise, with what we had in the pilot. The hair and makeup's fantastic. Martha and Jonathan look just like they did in the pilot for those 1989 scenes, and I really like what was done with 80s Sheriff Ethan. This show might not know anything about Kansas, but it can at least approximate fashions and hairstyles from the late 80s. There's also some great bits of continuity this fills in, like why Lionel knows who the Kents are in Red, and how he and Martha seem familiar with each other before he hires her as his personal assistant. Believe it or not, I have very little negative to say on this one. I think it's a fine piece of television, and that's amazing given that this one was written by Kenneth Biller, who SF Debris is always pointing out has some of the weaker scripts for Star Trek Voyager. Though, now that I'm looking it up, he also wrote Red, which would explain the consistencies with Lionel and Martha, especially since I'm sure he knew this was coming. I'll point some of them out as we get to them, but he actually wrote a couple of my favorite episodes, so perhaps he's just better at family drama than he is at science fiction. The most glaring problem for me is that there's no mention in this episode at all that Martha is working for Lionel. I don't know if these were shot or written out of order or what happened, but once we finally know Jonathan and Lionel's histories, it is impossible for me to accept that she would have ever considered working for the man that forced Jonathan to basically hand the whole town over to him in order to keep his son. Jonathan refused to ever take Luthor money from Lex before this. In the pilot, Jonathan tells Clark that he needs to understand where the money came from that bought the truck Lex gave to him as a gift. Jonathan sees it as dirty money. And now that dirty money is part of their regular income, it's no wonder Jonathan had such a problem with her working for Lionel. And in fact, he should have been even angrier, I think. It's really swept under the rug, and given how good this episode is at making other things work I wouldn't have thought could work, I wish it would have tried to make Martha working for Lionel make more sense. Now, I'm of two minds about Rachel Dunley. On the one hand, with the fake adoptions and the illegitimate children and the ultimatums and the buy-offs, we're bordering on soap opera, like I said, to the point where I wish this episode could have been resolved without a kidnapping plot and attempted murder. On the other hand, as we'll find more and more as the series goes along, those are the kinds of insane consequences that always come along with Lionel's decisions to ruin people's lives in order to get what he wants. I actually like that Dunley really is crazy and that Lionel drove her to it. Her trying to kill Lex is silly, but I also buy her getting to that place, and I like that it all makes sense in her head. Most Smallville antagonists go right for the killing. This woman tried everything else first. Heck, compared to most Kryptofreaks, she's reasonable. I wish Lex running his own company was in the foreground for the season in general. We get a LexCorp logo on a garage door in this episode, and it's the one and only time I can recall in the series we see it. Even having seen these episodes several times, I still found myself thinking, oh yeah, that's right, he bought the plant, I forgot. And questions to ask Jarrell when I get to heaven. Is Smallville really that far west? I want to put a placeholder here for a point I'm going to make later this season when we get to Rosetta. I won't make the full point now because it's not entirely this episode's fault, but I feel like I need to lay the foundation for it. We get a Kansas zip code in this episode when Clark and Chloe find Dunleavy's address, which, by the way, is pretty hokey now that I think about it. Some realtor let her put a house in Lucas Luthor's name. I don't even kinda buy that. That's just a plot contrivance so Clark can find her house and jump in at the last minute to take an axe to the back. It's like Alfred protecting the secret of Batman with a 3-letter password in Batman and Robin. It's not quite that stupid, but it's still pretty bad. Anyway, the zip code is 67524. That's actually a real Kansas zip code for a town called Chase in western Kansas. Now, I've lived in Kansas a lot of my life, in Lawrence, where the University of Kansas is. That's where I studied English. And I always had the sense, just from the size of the town and how built up everything seems around it, that it was probably closer to Topeka or Kansas City than anything. When I was living in Lawrence when I was a kid, there was a lot more farmland around the city, and now all that's built up, and there's a lot of businesses all the way around where we used to just see a whole lot of crops. But according to the zip code, which I'm assuming was thrown in arbitrarily, oh, we need a zip code, somebody jump on a search engine and make sure it's in Kansas, they're 200 miles away from Lawrence. Keep that in mind. 200 miles away, in the middle of nowhere. Believe it or not, that'll be important later. It also makes me even more confused as to where the heck Metropolis is. And now let's go to the scoreboard. Not a lot this time around, which is usually a sign of a better episode. We do have a couple new categories. One is Superman alum actors. I just thought this might be kind of fun to count. Patrick Cassidy, who was a returning character in Lois and Clark as Leslie Luckabee, who was supposed to be Lex Luthor's son. Kind of ironic, given this episode is all about family lineages, most of which are affected somehow or another by the Luthors. Another new category is Lex siblings. We've got one of those. Lex actors who aren't Rosenbaum. Finally, we've got another one of those. We've got one rude super speed exit. That's, of course, Clark running off when Chloe shows him that address. We've got one instance of somebody walking away from somebody else angry. That's Jonathan right at the end when he says, "This is my decision, my fault." Now, granted, he's not walking away because he's angry at anybody in the room other than himself, but I'm still going to count it. And finally, we've got one instance of convenient unconsciousness. That's Lex when Clark saves him from the crazy axe lady. I'm going to give Lineage a 4 out of 4. There are some episodes way down the line, especially when we get to the Veritas stuff and then into 8 with the Doomsday mess, that kind of lessen the enjoyment and credibility of this one. But as an hour of television and in sequence with what we've had so far, this is exactly the kind of family drama with a hint of the fantastic that I always wanted from this show. Was there anything I missed in any category? Leave me a personal message on Geekvolution, and I'll be sure to add it to the count. I'm Captain Logan, and consider this episode counted.